There is an empty plate where my name should be, a napkin folded like a small, offended flag. 12 polished silver knives, forks, and spoons line the table under the low Roman light, but not the 13th place. No place card with my name, no tiny gilded tent announcing that I belong at this table. The Colosseum hangs behind the terrace like a patient audience. The candles burn steady. The sommelier hands out menus as if nothing is missing. My voice is calm when the words come. Calm because shock is heavy. Calm because I have built a career on keeping my hands steady when chaos is in the room. Seems I'm not family, I tell Sean. He looks away. Eleanor's laugh works the way it always does, smooth, practiced, a necklace of sound that keeps you on the outside. I do not make a scene. I do not raise my voice. There is a long, thin sort of rage that waits inside people who have been trained to plan weddings and galas for a living. It's precise, like waiting for the perfect cue to pull the lights on. I fold my coat, let the Valentino gown move like water as I walk. I leave the hotel terrace and the 100 eyes and the clink of ice in glasses, and I sit at a small cafe down the street with a view of the Via dei Fori Imperiali. The espresso is too bitter. I do not taste it. Around me, Rome continues to insist on beauty, motor scooters weaving, a vendor selling postcards, tourists leaning toward one another over maps. I watch the terrace through binoculars, more for work than for revenge. My training has taught me to assess sightlines and guest flow. I memorize where the maitre d' will stand, where the family will look to make a spectacle. The absence of my place is the spectacle. This did not begin tonight. If you're here for stories that end with people finding their dignity again, stay with me. Subscribe and follow. I promise you, this one is worth it. I started my company in a tiny office above a laundromat in Boston. The radiator rattled in winter. The first time I paid to hire an assistant outright, I cried at my desk because the deposit was a down payment on proof that I could make something real. I crammed my hair into a bun, handed out contracts with my business card stamped in gold foil, and learned how to coast a room into remembering a moment as if it were always meant to be theirs. Sean came in for a client meeting. He thought he was being charming when he complained about the city's weather, and he forgot to notice that I had already finished his coffee. He had the smoothing arrogance of people who have always been accepted. We fell in love the way people in my line of work are sometimes allowed to, in the margins between calls, over late-night spreadsheets for other people's weddings. There was a warmth to him I had not expected. There was also a family, an enormous house in the suburbs, a history of ostrich-feathered galas and Lady Eleanor, who wore reserves of approval like shoulder pads. At first, the differences were small enough to be easily forgiven. At our rehearsal dinner, Eleanor mispronounced my name like a small, polite dismissal. At family brunches, she would correct my fork grip in front of guests as if I were an untrained apprentice. The barbs came wrapped in tea, the exclusions in footnotes. Charming was a word she used when she wanted to place me under glass, an accessory on the arm of her son. I earned my way in by doing what I do. I turned her parties into perfect narratives. I learned to place cards like tiny promises, ivory cardstock, calligraphy, the weight of a ribbon. People would leave her events feeling elevated, as if they had stepped through a threshold into a world that deserved them. She would smile. The acceptance I wanted never arrived. Instead, I was kept at a lovely, safe distance. The first real fracture came with money. The Caldwell fortune, as I later learned, had texture that didn't match the lacquer. It was paper-thin in places and brilliant in others. I found an innocuous bank statement in a drawer once. A mistake, a loophole. I told myself nothing until much later. That's how unfaithfulness starts. Small, mundane things tucked into pockets where tides of secrecy form. The affair started as a text thread that stunned my phone awake at 3 a.m. I still remember the way the words scrolled across the screen. Careless, intimate, ordinary. Vanessa's name sat at the top like a second place card. The messages were not coded for lovers. They were banal, domestic, hurry to lunch, miss you. Then once a photo of a sonogram, the edges soft and light as hope. I did not read every line like a verdict. I read them as a professional reading a program. The stage directions were there, time, intent, outcome. There was also a draft printed on the desk, an announcement that would have made my exit tidy and ceremonial. We regret to announce. The paper had been drafted by someone with a gift for language. It was precise in its cruelty. There was also money. The finances looked like a classic stage set, glittering front, hollow back. Statements that must have been intended to lull scrutiny instead set off alarm bells in me. Offshore accounts, transfers labeled as trust maintenance, a series of wire transfers timed to coincide with fiscal years when certain holdings were due to be evaluated. Not all of this was illegal. This world thrives on legal mineshafts, but it was opaque, and where there is opacity, power hides. I sat on a chair in a study that smelled faintly of polishing wax and old wool, and felt for the first time like the person in a play who finally sees the script. When Eleanor called and told me casually that the dinner would be for family only, I should have taken it as the last cue. Instead, I continued to collect the cues. They planned my exclusion in the kindest of ways, a seating list arranged without me, an aside and a phone call to the villa manager that meant to make me invisible. Carmen, the villa manager, was efficient. When I bumped into her on a morning in June, trace of salt on her hair from the coast, she handed me a logistics memo with a professional smile and a line that later would sit in my head like a needle. 12 seats, not 13. She thought nothing of it. She assumed Eleanor's authority was unquestioned. She did not know that the phrase would be the chord that struck everything else into clarity. I walked out of the villa that day and did the work I always do, cataloged what I knew, considered what I didn't, and began to make the list of whom to trust. My instincts had been honed on timelines and contingency plans. When people told me I was overreacting, I looked at the receipts and the texts and the draft, and I did not say anything. I photographed everything with a calmness that surprised me. I made copies and left originals where they lay, because there is a kind of violence that comes from taking what's not yours. What I wanted was evidence, not revenge. There are lines you don't cross when you run a business. I never considered crossing them. No breaking into accounts, no secret passwords. Instead, I called the people I had trusted in my work. Marco, the maitre d' in Rome, who had once saved a wedding they thought was ruined by a thunderstorm. Carmen, who managed villas with the sort of detail that made them feel like private worlds. Marco's colleague at the restaurant. The vendors who loved the certainty of a contract more than anything else. I also called a lawyer. Lawyers are the people who translate emotional truths into legal ones. They are the ones who can make a document that weighs like an anchor. My lawyer told me what I already suspected. I had standing because I had arranged, guaranteed, or paid for substantial portions of the events, and because there were written communications that evidenced intent. She told me what I needed to hear and what I didn't, how to protect myself legally, how to preserve the evidence, how to notify vendors in a way that would not expose me to claims of interference. She was procedural and kind, and her voice steadied me. At first, I thought about confronting Sean in front of everyone. The whole country would have watched that collapse. Eleanor's laugh, the guests' forked eyebrows, the triumphant underside of old money exposed like a seam ripping. That would have satisfied something primitive inside me. I did not do it because my profession taught me that spectacular scenes rarely lead to real outcomes. They make headlines, they do not fix bank statements, custody issues, or the quiet theft of dignity. Instead, I did the thing that felt for me most cathartic. I became my own vendor. I read through the contracts I had signed for the week of events in Rome with the meticulous eye of someone who spends their life reducing chaos into schedules. I found clauses about deposits, conditions of cancellation, misrepresentation, and client authority, lawyer-approved language that meant more when both sides had signatures. I had used my company's name on certain deposits, not out of vanity, but because the family's account had been in flux. I had done it to protect dates and to secure the best suppliers in a market where anything can disappear in a heartbeat. That payment trail gave me leverage, but it was leverage of a legal, not extra-legal variety. I spoke to Marco quietly in the back room of the restaurant 2 nights before Eleanor's celebration. He was a man who believed in service and in not being surprised on a night he would have to explain something to an expectant guest. "If the client changes the contract, you tell me," I said. He nodded. He liked order. Carmen and I walked the villa together one afternoon and stood in the kitchen where the corks were kept. She had been in the business so long, her hands remembered what the guests forgot. "Do what you need to do," she said when I told her some of what I had found. It was not moral support so much as a practical observation. People like us do not have the luxury of drama. We have an eye for consequence. When the messages started, they did not begin with fireworks. An email here that reflected a deposit reversed because the bank saw a change in authorization, a text from a florist that said their trucks were reassigned, a message from a projectionist that the AV company had double booked because of a sudden unexplained block. Each vendor did what vendors do when they are unsure. They alerted the client and then they paused, pending clarification. The pause is a surgical thing that can cut through a lie if wielded correctly. My phone filled with small threads. Refund initiated pending clarification. We cannot proceed without confirmed authorization. Please advise. To anyone else, it would have looked like an inconvenience. To someone who reads contracts for a living, it looked like the beginnings of an unraveling. One by one, the safety nets pulled. I kept all the messages. I printed them. I sent a message to my lawyer with a single line. We are ready to proceed on Monday. Her reply came with a calmness that felt like an assurance of weather on the horizon. We have everything documented. Proceed when you are ready. When you plan an event, you do not ever truly detach from the emotional underside of what you create. I had poured banners and playlists and passed hors d'oeuvres into the architecture of these celebrations. I had written Eleanor's gala script that had always placed her at the center. I had the receipts of my involvement. I had the things people ignore until they cannot be ignored anymore. The contract signed in my company's name, my deposits, the chain of emails from vendors acknowledging my authority on behalf of the family. There is a power in paperwork. It is not glamorous, but it is brutally effective. The week of the birthday arrived like a shift in weather. Rome, sunny the day before, took on a different quality, as if the city itself braced for something it did not yet understand. I watched them arrive on the terrace through the binoculars. Eleanor in black silk edged with pearls, Sean with a hand that trembled just slightly when I saw them speak, the cousins who had flown in with perfumes like small flags. They settled into the ritual of greeting one another, the small adjustments and performances of belonging. I sat in the cafe, in the same chair as before, and I watched how confidence can look like entitlement, and how entitlement can crumble when the ordinariness of supply refuses it. A waiter arrived at their table with a tablet. He was young and earnest. I had worked with this restaurant before. I knew his face. He tapped the tablet. He scrolled. He looked up, mouth forming a polite apology before the words arrived. There was the briefest swallow of air in the room where the caution flag was raised, and then protocol. There is a cruelty in my industry that is quiet and efficient. We are used to cleaning up messes, to making lives look seamless on a timeline. Tonight, the mess belonged to someone else, and for the first time since I had been made into an accessory, I had the chance to exert the clarity my trade taught me. My hands do not shake when I make what comes next. I had rehearsed, in my head like a production, the walk from the cafe, the approach to the maitre d', the delivery of evidence to the person who could make a truth visible. But rehearsals are one thing. Reality, with its low murmurs and the clink of a champagne flute, is another. I can see them inside. Eleanor's necklace catching a stray light, Sean's jaw set to a line a man uses to hide his culpability. I stand to leave. The city fills my lungs with dust and citrus and the sharp note of motor oil. I want them to see me approach. I want the spectacle of my departure and the small flickers of consequence to line up for them. I want Sean to see that I had been keeping receipts and that my hands had been steady the whole time. But there is another instinct, older, quieter, that keeps me from emerging like a thunderclap. My lawyer's voice echoes, as does my own training. Precision, not noise. I fold my scarf into my coat, step toward the terrace, and then stop. Marco's expression as he approaches the family is unreadable. He is professional and kind, the sort of man who enjoys not being the center of attention. He glances at me, recognition, calculation, and then at the tablet in his hand. People at the table lean in, expecting to hear an explanation about the amuse-bouche or the kitchen's timing. Marco clears his throat in a way that reads like a stage cue. The room holds its breath in the manner that full rooms do when an unexpected note changes the program. The maitre d' looks down at the tablet again, and for a moment the glow paints his face the color of a small, soft-screen sunrise. Eleanor's laughter falters. I could walk back now and stand and say the words. I could produce the texts and the draft and the bank statements and make the tableau of their privilege rearrange itself under the light. Instead, I stand, and the line of my jaw tightens, and I let the pause be long enough. This was always a story about more than a missing place at a table. It was about the steady theft of belonging and the slow accretion of proof. It was about the work I had done, my name written in ink on contracts and receipts, and about a network of vendors and professionals who, when alerted, began to respond in the way that the industry does, with contractual caution. It was about a lawyer who had told me to breathe and to wait for the right moment to let the paper do the talking. And it was about the unglamorous, quiet satisfaction of having built something that could not be erased by a tittered aside. When I finally crossed the small stretch of pavement and re-enter the terrace. People turn. They see me in the Valentino, and the gown is like a clarity. It is not armor so much as a reminder of the life I have made. My heels make the sort of sound used in movies to announce a heroine in slow motion. The sommelier's hand hovers over a bottle of champagne. Marco looks at me, then looks at the table, then at his tablet. The sound in the room is an intake, a collective leaning forward as if the audience wants to know how the plot will bend. Sean meets my eyes. For a moment I read the fear there like an open script. I do not raise my voice. I do not gloat. I set my bag down with deliberate calm. I say only what must be said, because the best reveals are surgical beats and not parades. I had a place, I tell them. There is no place set for me now. He knows. Eleanor, who has spent a lifetime orchestrating the world around her to maintain an appearance, tightens a smile into something fragile. The waiter taps his tablet. Marco exhales one of those small managerial breaths that means he is going to do his job. He says to the table, and with a professional sorrow I find oddly satisfying, "I am terribly sorry, but there appears to be a problem with the authorization for tonight." A ripple moves across the linen. Forks pause midair. Someone says, "What do you mean?" I look at Marco and he nods once. A single authorization of shared intent. The tablet screen glints. I have for weeks done the work that results in this small, precise moment. I have documentation. I have copies. I have a lawyer on standby. I have vendors who have exercised their lawful rights when asked to, and I have a body of evidence that will not be silenced by a laugh or an elegant scoff. The table is still. The candles burn. I am not finished. The story is not over. The tablet glints again, and Marco's apology becomes the hinge on which the evening swings. He speaks into the air that has grown thick with expectation. "I'm sorry, but we can't proceed without proper authorization on the account." He does not say my name. He does not have to. The words travel like a wave. There is a scramble of whispered phone calls, the scrape of chairs, the sound of silver hitting porcelain as a guest puts down a fork. Eleanor's smile fractures. She reaches for something, her purse, a napkin, Sean's sleeve, and her hand trembles the way a conductor's does before a piece goes off the rails. Sean's mouth works. For a second I see the man I loved and the man who chose silence against me, and they are two separate reflections in the cut glass of a wine glass. They look at me then, not with the same practiced politeness, with the rawness of people caught mid-performance. "You will explain," Eleanor says. Her voice is the brittle thing that happens when a woman who has always been the organizer of appearances realizes the script no longer belongs to her. "I will explain," I say. Calm, precise. There is a crowd watching. Cousins who once called me charming in a half-joke. Family friends who have never known what to do with a self-made woman in their midst. The staff who had once deferred to Eleanor as if she were weather. The waiter's tablet glows faint and impartial. Marco hands it to me as if it were a prop I am meant to use. I tap nothing. I do not need to. I reach into my bag, and with the same deliberation I used to pull out a contract at a client meeting, I take out an envelope. The paper has the weight of an industry memo. I do not slide it across the table like a melodramatic reveal. Instead, I stand and lay it on the linen, where the hem of my gown brushes the napkin and makes a single quiet sound. "This," I say, and my voice is the one I use when briefing a vendor, clear, without flourish, factual. Contains copies of communications I was not meant to see. It contains texts, drafts, and statements that show intent. It contains my company's deposits and communications with your vendors. Marco has copies. Carmen has copies. My lawyer has copies. I brought them because I expected that when the performance of Exclusion began, the truth would need an audience. The table bloats with murmurs. Someone says, "This is absurd." Another voice says, "How could she?" As though the notion that the woman previously labeled charming could engineer consequences is itself an absurdity. Sean pushes forward, face red with a blend of shame and a defiant, scared anger. "Anna, this is private," he says. The "this" a brittle attempt to make hurt invisible. "Private?" I ask. The single word is soft but precise. "Then why did you write an announcement for the family table? Why did someone make sure there would be 12 seats, not 13? His jaw tightens. Eleanor opens her mouth to redirect the conversation, to make it about bad timing or a misunderstanding. She is a woman who believes the world can be mended with speech, pronouncements, hospitality. "Is this how you resolved things?" she says, voice rising toward the brittle. "By shaming us in front of our friends?" I breathe. I have memorized the cadence of the room. I have rehearsed so many details in my head that I can feel how the light lies on the table, the way the candlelight hits the envelope like a marker. I do not want to shame. I want clarity and I want accountability. You arranged for my exclusion, I say. You planned for my absence at your celebration as a tidy domesticity, an unspoken decision. I had the option to make you uncomfortable here in a way that would become headlines. I chose not to. I chose instead to let our industry's procedures do the work. A cousin mutters about melodrama. Someone shifts in their chair. The waiter brings a glass over and sets it down carefully, as if something might break. Marco stands a professional step away, a man who has spent years smoothing the edges of other people's disasters. He has done as I asked. He has halted service pending authorization. He has handed the tablet to management and invoked policy. What happens next is not theater, it is process. Then a phone lifts at the other end of the table, one of Eleanor's older friends, I think. She has always been the kind of person who calls the right people at the right time. Her voice trembles on the line, and then becomes a quiet, insistent thing. We have a bank inquiry at our villa, she says. We have an inquiry at the restaurant. The AV company has a hold. The florist. Marco, Eleanor says, reaching for the familiar cadence she has always used to command. Marco, what is this? Who authorized? I'm following the authorization on file, he says. He is professional, which now feels like a form of justice. There is a request to verify. Our contract requires confirmed authorization. Until we have firm instruction from the party on file, we cannot proceed. There are ways of making noise that do not create results. I had seen those ways often. A raised voice, a dramatic censure, the kind of public crying that gets clicks but moves no ledger. I did not take those paths because they divert attention rather than create remedy. What I have done is not performative cruelty. It is the use of documented authority and contractual standing to insist that what you call family cannot simply reframe reality to suit its own narrative. Sean slams his palm down on the table. The sound makes people look. You have no right, he says. I have the rights of my company, I reply. I have the receipts. This isn't about revenge. It's about consequences for decisions that were made behind closed doors. He stands. He reaches toward me with that imploring hand people use when they are not sure which version of themselves they want to be in public. Please, he says. Please, Anna, don't. But by then we both know there is no path back to the table. The evidence sits like a calm authority between us. My lawyer's note had said, be careful, be factual. Do not let emotion turn the narrative. I follow that counsel because a story told with facts is the only kind that survives scrutiny. The rest of the evening is a slow, businesslike dismantling of the performance these people had prepared. The sommelier retreats to the side with an apologetic set of shoulders. A photographer who had been waiting for the family to pose slips away with a camera that now feels like a witness. The staff move with the exactitude of people trained to manage hospitality and disaster in equal measure. The cancellations ripple outward in a tidy, lawful way. Deposits are reversed where contracts permit. Vendors note the change in authorizing party, and the hotel's concierge quietly logs calls. It does not happen like in the movies. There is no collective gasp, no dramatic falling of chandeliers. There is a quiet folding. The laughter that had once been Eleanor's defense turns brittle and then thin as plastic. I watch Sean's face as the layers peel. First shock, then anger, then something like grief. His hands curl into fists and then unclench. Outside, the city goes on. A scooter hums. A couple argues in Italian about a map. A street vendor calls for customers. Rome is indifferent to private collapses. That is its mercy. That is also its cruelty. When the table is cleared and the staff retreat to the back rooms to write up incident reports and finalize financial steps, Eleanor speaks again. This time, the voice is smaller, but still the old rhythm that thinks the world responds to ordination. If you are going to make accusations, do it properly, she says. Bring them to the table. We will handle this. You will not. I already brought them, I say. To Marco, to Carmen, to the vendor liaisons. They are with my lawyer. They will be in the hands of people who will evaluate them properly. I did not come to humiliate. I came to make sure the things that were taken from me, my place at a table, my dignity, would be recognized. Sean's face collapses then, briefly, in a way that makes every memory I have of him ache. He reaches for his phone, fingers trembling. He calls someone, perhaps Vanessa, perhaps a friend, words spilling in a panic under his breath. I have learned over the years to read those moments. They are the glances before a confession, the tilt before someone offers their truth and expects it to be swallowed politely. Eleanor stands then, hands fluttering as if to bat away mess. We will speak in private, she says, as if privacy could reverse wiring in a bank or unread texts. We will sort this out, Anna. Sort it out with your counsel, I answer. My counsel will be in touch. They do not ask me to stay. They do not attempt to change my mind. The restaurant feels suddenly like a stage where someone has pulled a trapdoor and left the cast to decide who will take the next vow. I pick up my bag, smoothing the gown with my palm, and walk away while they argue about logistics. The air is cool against my face, and I realized I had planned this whole moment for clarity more than theater. Later, in the quiet of the hotel corridor, Carmen meets me with a small paper cup of espresso. Her face is tired, sympathetic in that architect of practicality way she reserves for people who run their lives on guest lists and floor plans. You did what you had to do, she says. I didn't want to hurt anyone, I say. You hurt because you were hurt, she replies. We are not without scars. We both know that the next steps will not be simple. A family's reputation does not unravel quietly. It tangles in the papers of banks and the inquiries of reporters and the questions of friends. But for the first time in years, my name is not a whisper at the end of someone's sentence. It has weight. Back in the hotel room, I call my lawyer. Her voice is procedural, the kind of voice one hears in courtrooms and in boardrooms. We will issue a statement if you want, she says. We will file what we need. We'll request copies of the transactions you flagged and get the audit running. Keep everything, Anna. Do not delete anything. Do not respond to media without us. She's right, as always. The lawyer's job is to translate the hurt into formal language, to make documents speak as testimony. There is a comfort in the road of legal steps, soothing, logical, protective. My hand shakes just enough as I photograph one more text and scan another bank line into a folder labeled in my company system, Evidence Caldwell. It feels absurdly adult, but it is how such things are preserved. The next week is a blur of procedures. My lawyer opens channels with the vendors I had used. There are calls to banks to flag suspicious transfers. There are inquiries from a lawyer representing the Caldwell estate, thinly veiled threats mixed with bland civility. I hold to the counsel I had received. Be precise, be factual, and do not give the press the kind of raw moment they crave. We prepare a letter requesting a formal accounting of assets and an explanation for the transfers I had seen. We request counsel for Sean in terms of how his involvement will be clarified. It is all painfully procedural and perfectly necessary. The press, when it does arrive, is a careful thing. I had not wanted headlines about betrayal. Ironically, the public tends to consume humiliation with a hunger not unlike gossip at a family table. Some local outlets run pieces that are measured, crediting statements from lawyers and noting inquiries into financial irregularities.
The story is not a scandal in the tabloid sense. It develops as a business story and a social one, a narrative about the vulnerability of appearances when they lack the substance to sustain them. There are people who call with offers of interviews and go on about dramatic reveals. My lawyer instructs caution, and I follow it. When a reporter asks if I'm seeking revenge, I answer with a phrase that has come to me like a kind of prayer. I sought clarity. It's not dishonest. It is protective. It is the sentence I want my work to be defined by. Meanwhile, Sean begins to unravel in ways that are both petty and sad. Texts that were private become points of heated exchange between him and members of his family. Vanessa remains a shadow in most of the exchanges. There is no cruelty in how I handle her. She is the one who will carry someone else's child. She deserves privacy and dignity. The conversations about custody and responsibility are for lawyers and courts, not for a cafe's gossip. I tell myself this because it is the humane thing to do, and because my role has never been to humiliate individuals, but to hold accountable systems. The Caldwell family, being what it is, negotiates in places I will never be part of. There are strained calls and closed-door meetings, and the inevitable lawyers who try to smooth accounts and spin narratives. A few family members reach out with the awkwardness of people trying to find footing on ice. Others avoid me. Some have the decency to offer a neutral, "I'm sorry you felt excluded." Those words are small, but more than nothing. I keep them like small slips of exchange rate, useful sometimes, inadequate always. The divorce is not a public performance. It is a set of documents filed, countersigned, and mediated. There are arguments about property and about the degree to which the assets, which on paper looked substantial, are entangled and located across jurisdictions. The offshore accounts that once seemed monolithic reveal themselves to be mosaicked, with layers of legitimate corporate structuring, and also, as my counsel insists, questionable diversions. I am careful not to narrate this as if I had uncovered some cinematic conspiracy. That is not the truth. The truth is more boring and more real. There was misrepresentation, and some assets were hidden in ways that required legal teasing out. My lawyer presses for immediate protective measures, temporary orders that ensure I retain access to business accounts and my personal accounts, that stop the transfer of assets while the inquiry proceeds. These are not dramatic. They are necessary. They are the legal skeleton that allows life to continue. There are lawyers for both sides, and there are negotiations. I walk into mediation rooms with the same steadiness I bring to client briefings. I do not relish the process. I do not hate Sean for the man he once was. I simply accept that he made choices that meant we could no longer be a part of the same life.
When the settlement is finally drawn, and it isn't the windfall some might have imagined, it is a document that restores me to independence. It is careful to avoid extravagance, because that was never the point. It is careful to protect me from future sudden shifts. It gives me back my identity, the name on my company, the accounts I use for payroll, the ability to enter contracts under my own authority. There is dignity in that restoration. There is relief. The aftermath is not a neat, cinematic montage. Instead, there are small victories. A florist who had worked with me for years sends a note, "Your professionalism saved the week," and beneath it a line about a new client who wants me to design an anniversary dinner for a gallery opening. A caterer calls and asks if I might consult on a high-profile corporate retreat. My inbox, previously thick with tense emails, now admits opportunities. Business doesn't erase hurt, but it is the thing that steadies hands. There are press mentions that spin in different directions. The local paper writes about inquiries into the Caldwell accounts, quoting lawyers on both sides. An industry magazine profiles my work and mentions in a neutral tone how disputes sometimes become lessons in contracts and safeguards. There is curiosity, but the tone is shifting away from personal spectacle to professional consequence. That is in part because I have insisted on it. My narrative is factual, measured, centered on accountability. People reach out in the weeks and months that follow, old clients, colleagues, strangers who say thank you because they saw in my actions a mirror of their own quiet dignity. Women who had been quietly excluded from family tables write to say they found courage to leave harmful situations. There is a steady, understated chorus of messages. Your story mattered, not because of the spectacle, but because it was a story of reclaiming. There are nights when the loss of what my marriage had been makes me ache. I find myself flipping through old folders of contracts we signed together, wedding photos where we look younger and less guarded. Sean messages occasionally, sometimes with apologies that feel like rehearsed lines. I read them, breathe, and keep them as evidence of the man who existed in a particular past. Forgiveness is not a thing that can be forced. It arrives, if it ever does, like a soft guest. Professionally, I pivot. I take the calls I want. I start accepting events that align with my values. Kitchens that treat staff well, venues that operate transparently, clients who insist on written accounts. I teach a masterclass on contingency planning that sells out. I find new pleasure in being the authority I had always been quietly striving to be. There is a freedom in making decisions alone and seeing them come to fruition. Rome recedes, not like a wound, but like a hard lesson. I book a 3-day writing retreat on the Amalfi Coast because someone had once given me a journal and said, "You should write." I laugh at how cliché that sounds, but I go anyway. There I sit on a terrace that looks down at a blue so severe it feels like a secret, and I write the edges of my story in a way that doesn't demand spectacle. The missing chair is a motif I return to often in my notes, 12 seats, not 13, as a lesson in belonging and misbelonging. One evening on the coast, the sun skids low, and the sea glows the color of tears that have dried into something like acceptance. I order a small plate of anchovies and a glass of Prosecco, not champagne this time, because both luxury and restraint have their seasons. A waiter, tanned and practical, brings the drink and smiles without appreciation of the story I carry now. I do not need him to. I raise my glass to the empty place that once seemed a wound and now reads more like a turning point. To the missing chair, I say to no one and to everything. It is not vindictive. It is a small benediction. To the moment that taught me how to value myself, to the ways in which dignity demands more than an apology. My business thrives in the months that follow, I am busier than I had been in years, and the projects I take on feel like deliberate choices rather than obligations. I hire an assistant who has the kind of patience I used to have in the subway years ago, the one who remembers that deposits matter and that making someone feel welcomed is a craft. We talk late into nights over coffee about how to make events that are inclusive rather than performative. It feels good to build not just transactions, but principles. Sometimes, in the quiet of my office as dusk settles over Boston and the radiator hums its familiar note, I think about Eleanor. I do not imagine her alone. She has ways of surviving that a world without scandal sometimes offers. But I do think about how certain kinds of power borrow dignity and then spend it like credit. Power that needs an accessory always has bankruptcy waiting. People ask me now, friends who know me from before the wedding, new acquaintances at a business mixer, if I feel revenge. The word is blunt and unsatisfying. Revenge was sweet, someone writes in a flutter of comments under a short post I made, and the phrase sits there like a shard of something bright. It is true, but not in the cruel way people imagine. It was sweet because it tasted like justice, quiet, lawful, and earned. It was sweet because I did not become what had hurt me. I exercised authority I had earned, and in doing so, I found a dignity restored. I do not want to instruct anyone that orchestrating cancellations is a path to freedom. That would be irresponsible. My route was particular to the knots of my life, the professional leverage I happened to hold, the legal counsel who guided me.
The lesson I share is simpler. Know what you own, your contracts, your bank statements, your voice, and protect it. When you have been given the tools to defend yourself, use them, not for spectacle, but for truth. Months later, I watch from a balcony as a new event unfolds for a client who trusts me implicitly. The table is set with candles and small cards with names in neat calligraphy. I check the guest list out of habit more than necessity. Each place card bears a name that matters to the dinner's intent: collaborators, artists, people who have earned their seat. I think of the Colosseum that watched over Rome the night of my exclusion, of the valet who had once smiled past me, and of the waiter who had set the tablet down with an apologetic face. Someone at the table raises a glass and asks for a toast to standing for what we believe, and I feel the warmth of solidarity. I raise my own glass, and when I speak, it is short and true. To the people who keep their hands steady when chaos sits at the table, I say, they hear what I mean. They know the kind of work that steadiness requires. My words are not about revenge. They are about reclamation. That night, after the event, a woman approaches me, late 30s, tired smile, and a resignation I know too well. She takes my hand, eyes bright. "I was at that Roman dinner," she says. "I didn't know what to do. Thank you." "You didn't have to do anything then," I tell her. "You showed up after." She laughs then, a small, grateful thing, and walks away with a dignity that has shifted like the light at dusk. There are small, private victories, too. My assistant calls to tell me a client praised the way we handled a last-minute logistical nightmare. A vendor sends a note about how their team felt respected in our dealings. These are not the satisfying roar of public vindication. They are the low, steady hum of work done right. Occasionally, the Caldwell name drifts past me in business reporting, inquiries, audit, estate adjustments. The press is predictably curious, but never hungry enough to sustain the sensation. People consume scandal and then move on. Life, mercifully, does not. On an early spring morning, I walk through the city and feel lighter, as if the years that had been stitched with careful diplomacy have unpicked and smoothed. I have friends who ask if I have resentment. I answer honestly. Residue, perhaps. Resentment is a shadow. I acknowledge it, but I do not let it direct my days. The missing chair remains a metaphor I use sometimes, in conversation and in the classes I give. I tell students that belonging is not always granted. Sometimes it must be claimed. I tell them that the most powerful thing is to prepare. Know your contracts, know your worth, and when necessary, let paperwork do the polite but firm work of consequence.
There are nights I still dream of a long table under low lights, and in the dream I stand and lay down an envelope and do not feel the tremor that once chased me. There is a small, private smile in that dream, and I wake with the echo of glass on linen. I have learned to let the sweet be quiet, not loud. The satisfaction wasn't in watching them fall apart. It was in witnessing the restoration of my life, my finances preserved enough to carry my company forward,
my name untangled from someone else's story, my freedom regained. I returned to my office and hired more staff, took on projects that mattered, and stopped apologizing for ambition. Sometimes someone will whisper, sometimes they mean to praise, sometimes to sting. You won. I do not think like that. The language of victory implies a sport that love is not. Instead, I think, I reclaimed myself. I kept my hands steady. I turned my training into armor that didn't cut, and that was the sweetest part. If you ever find yourself at a table where there is no place set for you, know this: dignity is not always given. Sometimes it is built, quietly, with paperwork and counsel and the company of those who understand fairness. And if you ever need to be reminded that you are worthy of a seat, remember the sound of a folded napkin on linen, the small, stubborn assertion that you exist and that your absence will be noticed. I raise my glass once more, not to the pain, not to the downfall of anyone, but to the recovery, to the people who taught me that steadiness can change a night, to the vendors who honored contracts, and to the lawyers who translated hurt into process, to the missing chair that taught me where I did and didn't belong, and to the life I rebuilt after it. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever been excluded and had to reclaim yourself, leave one sentence below about how you found your place again. Share this with someone who needs to hear that dignity can be defended and that quiet, lawful action often does the most lasting work.